Elena Savignano is an urban planner passionate about creating equitable, climate-resilient communities where all people can thrive. As a transport analyst at Ascent, she works at the intersection of environmental and transportation planning, analyzing how projects affect mobility. Elena holds a BA from Wheaton College in Massachusetts and a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from UCLA. So, with this all said, now I'm going to turn it over to Elena. Hi, Elena. I'm going to stop sharing.
Hello. Thank you, Paula. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. If you have any issues seeing it, please let me know. Okay, so hi, everyone. As Paula said, my name is Elena. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. I'm really excited to be here. Before I get started, again, I just wanted to say thank you to Paula for coordinating, chatting with me, and to Tony for welcoming me to PRN and for helping make today possible. As Paula said, this presentation draws from my UCLA capstone, Change for the Meter, exploring the equity implications of market price parking. Using primary and secondary data, I explored the travel preferences of LA County residents, investigated potential disparities in parking behavior, and evaluated pricing approaches that other cities have implemented. A bit about me. I graduated from UCLA, the Urban and Regional Planning program in 2023. I've kind of always had an interest in urban design and public policy, but it was really my time at UCLA that ignited my passion and fascination with transportation planning and policy and turned me into a parking nerd. So today I'll be talking about the environmental costs of driving, some successful strategies that have helped reduce levels of driving, the importance of parking policy, differences in travel behavior amongst different groups. I'll be discussing the potential benefits and burdens of what happens when we change the price of parking. And finally, I'll be discussing some findings from my research and some of the recommendations that I put forth in my capstone as to how we can design parking policy with equity in mind. But before I get too far into that, I want to just talk about two key terms that'll come up frequently today. Throughout the rest of this presentation, you'll hear the term market price parking used very frequently. As I reviewed an existing literature about parking policy, I noticed that different terms are used throughout existing studies, including market price parking, performance-based pricing, market dynamic pricing. And while the terms are all different, they all refer to policies that set parking prices according to demand, time of day, or location, and all aim to keep a few open parking spaces per block at all times. Equity is not quite as straightforward to define. As part of my capstone, I conducted a literature review to develop a more enhanced understanding of how equity is used in transportation planning. And what I found throughout the literature was that equity is defined differently. Some authors define it as a fair distribution of costs and benefits, not just now, but across generations, while others emphasize community partnership and giving everyone what they need in light of historical inequalities. For my research, I focused on one definition from Butler of giving everyone what they need today while considering how resources have been allocated in the past, and a definition from Carter et al., which discusses the distribution of benefits and burdens with the emphasis on partnership in the planning process. And specifically for my research, I look at how decision-making can center people who've historically been excluded from transportation policy and planning. I know as a PRN talk, I'm probably speaking to a room of experts here, but I just wanted to start with what inspired this research. Year after year, transportation accounts for a large portion of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. In 2022, over 28% of greenhouse gas emissions came from transportation. And as you see in this graph here, of that 28%, approximately 57% of emissions were from light duty vehicles. Research from August et al. Identified that pollutants from vehicle emissions have been linked with adverse health effects that often disproportionately affect non-white and lower income communities. So if we want to meet our climate goals and create healthier communities, we need to reduce driving. But how do we do that? Well, research by authors such as Crystal and Willens, Meyer, and Taylor have all shown that assertive pricing strategies are among the most effective means for reducing driving. Specifically, previous studies, such as one by Meyer in 1999, have demonstrated that when the true cost of driving shows up in our wallets, whether that's through increased insurance rates or congestion tolls or parking fees, people drive less. And they often shift to different modes of transportation like public transit, walking or biking, and congestion improves. And why? Because no one wants to pay more money. So these pricing strategies often deter new drivers who might have taken advantage of that additional roadway capacity to also not drive, which then in turn reduces congestion and emissions. Several pricing strategies have made some national news. You might have heard of them. New York City recently became the first city in the United States to introduce a cordon-based congestion charge for vehicles that enter the Manhattan Central Business District during peak hours. As you see on the slide, the price of who pays varies. But the early results of this program are promising. A working paper by the National Bureau of Economic Research showed that the program resulted in reduced congestion. It increased speeds, which led to shorter travel times, and it reduced carbon dioxide emissions. And something I found really notable about this program is that there is an option for a discounted toll rate for lower income drivers making $50,000 or less a year after their first 10 trips each month. Another program that's been implemented successfully is SF Park in San Francisco, which is their system for managing the availability of both on and off-street parking. They are adjusted based in response to demand, and by adjusting meter and garage rates every few weeks to hit an occupancy rate of 85%, the city encourages drivers towards underused blocks and parking garages and ensures that open spaces are available in busier areas. The preliminary evaluations found that occupancy fell on overcrowded blocks after price increases, and they rose on underused blocks after price changes. The program has resulted in less cruising for parking, more turnover, and overall better use of the existing parking supply. So given all the ways to price driving and the success of different methods, why focus on parking? Well, because most every car trip in the United States begins and ends in a parking space. A 2010 study estimated that over 99% of driving trips end in free parking. And in the words of the late, great Donald Shoup, there is a high cost to free parking. It encourages unnecessary car trips, allocates public space to private use. It can fuel congestion and shift costs like noise pollution and safety issues onto people who don't even drive. So knowing that free parking is bad and that we have evidence that pricing parking can change behavior and bring about positive results, the logical conclusion is that we should implement widespread market price parking. But as I'll show in the next few slides, travel behavior is not uniform across groups, and it's important to explore whether implementing market price parking and similar strategies could result in unintended consequences. So numerous studies have demonstrated that travel behavior and transportation burdens vary amongst groups. For instance, women tend to travel shorter distances and for shorter amounts of time than men. Women are more likely to trip chain, basically linking shorter trips together between destinations to and from work. These trips are often for caregiving or errands. Women also opt for private vehicle travel instead of other modes of transportation when they can, because it is the most flexible, convenient, and safe mode of transportation for them overall. There's also some differences across socioeconomic groups. Lower income households own cars. Approximately 78% of US households below the poverty line have at least one car. But as research has shown, car ownership doesn't necessarily mean frequent car use. Blumenberg found that low income households often share one vehicle, and these vehicles are often older and not as reliable. And additionally, low income drivers often make fewer trips and rely more heavily on their social networks or public transit as their primary means of travel, despite owning a car. So knowing that travel behavior varies, I was curious as to if parking behavior varied. And my research aimed to understand, would market price parking disproportionately burden certain drivers, and tried to uncover how policy can be designed more equitably to reduce any potential burden. Specifically, I opted to study how market price parking policies could adversely affect people of color, women, and lower income drivers. And to answer this question, I developed a mixed methods research approach. I conducted a literature review, which I kind of shared the findings from in the last few slides, paying particular attention to factors related to race, income, and gender as it pertains to travel behavior and parking. I analyzed secondary survey data from the Understanding America survey to understand driving and parking behavior of over 1,200 respondents in LA County. I conducted field observations on 2 blocks in Hollywood that had market price parking meters to better understand any potential gender and racial disparities in parking behavior. I also conducted some case studies to understand how other cities in the United States are approaching parking policy and community collaboration. And each of the case studies shed a different light on pricing strategies, community process, and revenue allocation. And then finally, using all of the information I uncovered from the previous steps of the research, I developed and administered a 9-question in-person intercept survey in Hollywood to better understand driving and parking preferences in the neighborhood. I just quickly wanted to touch on why I chose Hollywood as my primary neighborhood of study. There are 4 neighborhoods in LA that have market price parking programs, but I chose Hollywood specifically because of its high destination density and high percentage of residents who do not drive. And given in the limited time and resources for this research, focusing on one neighborhood was more realistic for my capstone. I'll kind of highlight limitations of each method as I talk through the findings, but I just wanted to emphasize, again, the limited time and resources of my capstone. So it was focused on Los Angeles and then again narrowed down into one neighborhood. It often had a small sample size, and therefore the findings and recommendations might not be applicable to or across other geographic areas. And while the findings might not translate everywhere, I do think that my findings help to shed a light on some of the equity concerns associated with pricing policies. So I opted to use the UAS survey facilitated by USC because it, unlike other data sets, included specific questions related to attitudes towards driving, perception of neighborhood parking availability, and parking expenses. One of the primary limitations of this data set was that there was no geospatial component associated with the survey, so there wasn't really a way to identify where in LA County the respondents were located. But despite these limitations, there were several notable findings from the survey. First, there was a statistically significant but weak relationship between gender and the perceived ease of finding neighborhood parking. Approximately 23% of women reported finding parking in their neighborhood difficult, compared to 15% of men. As we discussed, this could be because women have different travel behaviors and perhaps parking needs. So they might be looking for spots closer to their destination or spaces that they can stay short term. And safety and proximity needs could also help explain this gap. Additionally, there was a statistically significant relationship between the ease of finding parking and respondent income level. Specifically, over 56% of respondents who earned $150,000 a year or more said that neighborhood parking was easy, compared to only 18% of people earning $25,000 a year or less, and 17% of people with an income between $25,000 and $50,000 a year. And this finding could be related to the type of housing in which the respondents live. For example, suburban areas are more likely to have consistent access to free parking, whether that's private garage or just on-street free parking, whereas respondents living in denser areas with less expensive housing might not have a designated parking space and instead have to compete with other drivers in their neighborhood to find parking options. And then finally, there was a statistically significant but weak relationship between race and the ease of finding parking. 32% of respondents who identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, and 29% of respondents who identified as Black said that finding neighborhood parking was difficult, compared to 19% of respondents who identified as white and 12% of respondents who identified as Asian. I also conducted, as I said, observational study. I used spatial analysis to identify 2 blocks in Hollywood that had the most market price parking selection overall. And between the 2 blocks, identified 2 options that had different, but consistently different prices over different days and times, so that I could visit each block on separate days and get similar information. So the first key observation that was pretty evident the second I stepped onto the block was that there was free parking spaces adjacent to and across from the market priced parking meters. And throughout my observations, I noticed people consistently either cruising the block or making illegal U-turns to park in the free spaces, even when the metered price parking spaces were open. In my observations, 44% of observed drivers who parked in a metered spot didn't pay for parking. One driver saw me with my clipboard and asked if I was the parking lady. And when I said no, she chose to not pay the parking meter. So in addition to these observations, I did also see that many cars exceeded the posted time limit, which was 2 hours. Finally, there was no statistically significant difference between the observed driver gender and race and the use of the market priced parking spaces. The asterisk here is to just reemphasize that the driver's gender and race was assumed by me and therefore might not be accurate. And again, in addition, there was a small sample size and limited observations. But the key takeaway from this component of my research was that when a free alternative to paid parking exists, compliance and payment compliance will likely plummet. My team and I also conducted an intercept survey in Hollywood to better understand parking preferences. We surveyed 45 pedestrians who lived in Hollywood. Their residence was verified by zip code, and the small sample size, again, limits the ability to generalize the findings. And it's important to note that the people who did participate are those who had the time and the willingness to respond. But so because of that, it's likely that the responses aren't representative of all LA residents. But despite these limitations, the survey allowed me to get better insight into the variety of people's parking preferences and the responsiveness to potential parking related policies. The first kind of notable finding was that on average, women consider the price and duration of parking to be slightly more important than men. When asked if their parking preferences changed at night, approximately 66% of women and 25% of men said yes. In addition, just anecdotally, without prompting, people shared with me that they felt unsafe in their neighborhood after dark and therefore would be willing to pay a higher price and be closer to their destination during nighttime hours. And then both men and women agreed that the notion of paying a higher price for parking if they were able to stay in a parking space longer. Respondents were also asked to select a hypothetical allocation of revenue generated by parking meters, and approximately 50% chose to allocate any meter generated revenue to the community in which the meter is located, and the other half to a kind of more general city fund. So the range of responses demonstrated the support for flexible use of revenue generated from parking meters. And then the kind of final aspect of my mixed method study were case studies, where I looked to see where other cities offer practical lessons for designing more equitable parking policies. In December 2022, the Hoboken, New Jersey City Council adopted new meter rates to increase street parking turnover in business districts. Their policy aimed for 85% occupancy, similar to the program in San Francisco. Hoboken was a notable case study as it successfully implemented this strategy, which is often controversial, successfully with the majority support of politicians, business owners, and local residents. The program in Hoboken also offered residents a 50% discount on metered parking, and local businesses were given promo codes to share with customers that offered them a 50% discount on metered parking for up to 25 transactions. And this was made possible by a partnership with Park Mobile. And San Diego established their first parking benefit district back in 1997 and have since added 3 more. We can kind of chat about the current success of them, but at the time of my research, they were successfully implementing parking benefit districts where 55% of meter generated revenue was allocated to the parking district where the meters were located, and 45% were allocated to the community parking district. I think I mixed those numbers up. So 55% of the revenue was for the city and 45% went to the community parking district. They pull revenue from valet parking fees, residential parking permit fees, parking meters, and they're also able to use any other authorized fees to regulate parking. In order to make a parking benefit district, specific parties can submit a request to form a new parking district, but they have to use data to demonstrate how parking demand negatively impacts the community. Again, at the time of my research, each neighborhood in San Diego that had a parking district had its own subcommittee that developed proposals and budgets for local projects, and all residents and business owners within the proposed project area are supposed to be notified of any upcoming changes that have been implemented as a result of the program. So synthesizing kind of all of that research, before I put forth a couple recommendations, I just wanted to highlight that it's important to understand the pain points and needs in existing communities because they are also unique and might require different approaches to the same policy. In my capstone, I put forth 7 recommendations that could help distribute the benefits and burdens of market price parking in Los Angeles, but today I'll be focusing on 4 that could be more widely applicable. So first and foremost is meaningful and ongoing community engagement. I want to emphasize that this work is already being done. It's currently being done on the ground, and that most of the concepts listed here are not new or original to me. But when it comes to parking, I think it's really important to emphasize community engagement because of how contentious parking policy often ends up being. Um, so I think first and foremost, again, listen to the challenges that people have in their communities, giving consistent online and in-person opportunities to help shape policy is crucial, again, just given how contentious and how people feel about parking. Reimbursing community members for their time is also incredibly important because otherwise you might have people who can't afford to, volunteer their time, but might have meaningful ideas to contribute to participate. And then just keeping the conversation going. I think that any plan for meaningful community outreach has to include a way for community members and stakeholders to just continuously be able to share ideas and submit feedback on kind of what's happening on the ground. My next recommendation is to implement discounts at parking meters instead of exemptions. So as we saw in Hoboken, New Jersey, and with the pricing, congestion pricing in New York City, there are ways to offer discounts on parking to certain drivers. As it pertains to parking pricing, we could offer reduced rates for low income households, for households that only have one car, WIC participants via license plate linked apps like Park Mobile, or just through discount codes, again, like we saw in Hoboken. Doing so would reduce the financial burden that's often disproportionately placed on lower income drivers, while not entirely exempting them from paying for the cost of their driving. My other recommendation that I think could be more widely applicable is kind of removing the barriers to establishing parking benefit districts. We should be able to expedite the process to establish parking benefit districts as they help redistribute the benefits of on-street parking spaces and parking pricing policies. Priority areas for parking benefit districts could include neighborhoods where there's high density of on-street parking, but low levels of car ownership. We could ask the community to set a meaningful share of their revenue and what they want to see implemented as a result of the revenue that's generated in their community. Again, cities like San Diego have shown what that revenue is invested back into the community. Oftentimes that leads to more support for policies such as this one. And then I just want to also say that all recommendations here should be implemented alongside improvements to street design and public transit systems. First, by improving street design, whether that's through more pedestrian skill lighting or better sidewalks. Parking farther away from a destination could be more appealing. And in that sense, we could offer those who want to take advantage of lower parking prices, but might be concerned about their safety, the ability to kind of take advantage of these programs. And then finally, more research is definitely needed. While the work is being done, it's important to just continue learning more about the relationship between equity and parking policies. So the bigger picture here is, from me, is that I think if we do it thoughtfully, market price parking can be one of the most effective ways to reduce congestion, improve access to opportunities, and cut emissions, and while making our streets safer. While my research shows that equity impacts in Los Angeles were not always statistically significant, this won't necessarily be the case everywhere, again, because every community is unique. And my hope is that when market price parking policies are rolled out across different communities, that work is done alongside active study and community engagement. Couple citations here. And I just wanted to share some additional resources that relate to market price parking and parking reform in general. Of course, Parking Reform Network. Your YouTube channel is phenomenal. The speakers you've been able to bring in have been really informative, and I highly encourage anyone here to check those out if you haven't already. The recently established UCLA Center for Parking Policy, they have a lot of really interesting research pertaining to parking, and I think they have an email subscription list, which, again, you should take advantage of. And then kind of a local resource that I often refer to is Jonathan Pacheco Bell, based here in LA, and who has developed this embedded planning praxis of ways we can plan more meaningful communities alongside community members. So again, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come listening to me talk today about my capstone research. I always love connecting with people who are passionate about parking. So I've included my LinkedIn QR code here, and I'm happy to answer any questions or just chat more. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks. That was great. I read this paper recently and I enjoyed it. So I'm so glad you were able to come present for us. A couple questions. We have one question so far from the chat. It's kind of a clarification. The metered spaces, were they just metered or were they available in the app as well? So are you sure, like, are you able to know? I assume part of this is were you able to know that the people who weren't paying maybe weren't paying from another method?
That is a great question. The blocks I chose specifically didn't have like a separate allocation for parking, like a mobile option.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, and we have a question here, another coming in from Ellen. I'm surprised that only half the survey respondents supported reinvesting revenue back into the community. What did the other people want to be done with it? I guess it was it general fund, parking enforcement, like yeah, and yeah.
That's a great question. I had offered three hypothetical scenarios, one of which was all 100% of funds go into the community where the meters were located. And then the other option was 100% of revenue goes into like a general fund. And so 50% chose kind of an even split or any split between the two. And then the rest of the respondents chose either of those options.
It'd be interesting follow-up to find out, why they would prefer one or the other there.
Totally. More research.
Yeah, exactly. Liza asks, I have a question about framing this for the public. I'm often having this conversation, introducing tiered parking pricing in a community and have to have a snappy response to it, but this isn't equitable. What might your thoughts be on how to respond to the pricing?
That's a great question. And I think a tricky one. I think a follow-up to that is just kind of probing into more as to what their thoughts of why it's inequitable. I feel like just kind of diving deeper into people's preconceptions of, whether increasing the price of parking is inequitable is something that often comes up. I don't know if I have like a quick response to just kind of solve that or answer that question, but I do think that, again, that meaningful kind of taking the time to explore people's preconceived notions is important. I know that doesn't answer your question, but it's the best that's taken over.
I think sometimes we also try to start the conversation around the status, like like you did, interrogating whether the status quo is equitable
Right.
in itself. Like, I mean, there's an inherent
Yeah.
problem here. Yeah, I had a question here, which is, when your recommendations, is to more community involvement or, have community panels. And I wonder what you think about how we navigate the trade-off of the need for managing parking in cities, right? Or ideal, when we have congested parking or we're trying to provide access with what will be likely demands to like water down those policies, right? Almost I've been on these committees, and there's often,
Right.
you can have kind of a platonic ideal for this, and then they get watered down. And so, do you think like that a community asking the community for more recommendation, I guess I guess what I'm trying to get at is we have a lot of ideas, or we have professionals working in transportation that kind of know how to manage the curb. And
Mhm.
I use this analogy here, like what city councils often, insert themselves politically into curb management. If like a pipe breaks in the street, we don't ask the community for ideas of how the water bureau should fix it, right? Like they just go in and
Right.
fix it. And so we have transportation problems in our streets and we have access problems. How do we trade off the need for, like, what do you envision this community recommendations are, as opposed to, just kind of professionals potentially knowing what the best practice might be?
Yeah, I think I like the analogy with the water district, because I feel like in certain aspects of just how cities are run, there's kind of instances where, something like that happens and most people wouldn't be up in arms about it. But parking, as we see kind of across cities, towns, because I think, as Donald Shoup points out in his book, that because it's kind of been this free thing forever, any change to it is really just ignites strong reactions. And I think that because of that, that's why it's important to kind of talk with communities. And there are experts, obviously, who understand what needs to happen in order to reduce driving levels. But because when I think in LA, there's actually a good example. They just announced that they're going to increase or translate parking prices into Sundays, which used to be free. And as I was reading an article, I was just kind of scrolling through the comments because I saw that, read it, and was like, oh, people are going to be really upset about this. And one comment that stood out was from somebody saying, city council members don't understand what it's like to live in a high density neighborhood where we're constantly fighting for parking. And it might be easy for them to kind of just come in and say, this is what's happening, this is what's for the best. And I think that when there isn't, again, that community engagement component, even if it's just a matter of like listening and asking people, what's your experience been with parking? That's where that backlash comes in. And when you're fueled by that, you don't get to see the benefits. And I think people, especially as it pertains to parking, and specifically in LA, there's such a diverse set of neighborhoods where parking options vary so widely that it needs to be context specific. Otherwise, people are just going to be unresponsive to any potential benefit, in my opinion.
Mhm. Okay, we have some more questions in here. One is, from Joe, during your research, did you have any kind of engagement with institutions such as a hospital that this person, like institutions that might historically offer free parking and are resistant to changing their prices? So did you consider private parking going from free to paid, or using market rate
Mm.
pricing?
I didn't actually have any kind of engagement with those institutions. I was primarily focused just like on the on-street options, but I do think that that would be an interesting kind of avenue for further research, just understanding like historically, if you have free parking in these kind of larger places, again, and any change would probably draw some interesting responses.
There's a question from Russell, and I'm going to tie this into kind of just a general question I had put in front, which is, I'm curious to think of like, uh, what you think what you think the best way to expand this type of research might be, right? Like, so this is going to be a multi-part kind of thing, but
Okay.
should someone expand? Would you recommend someone expand the study in Hollywood specifically, like do a longer survey period? Try other areas? Or Russell and I had some ideas for like other questions. Like one question I had was, you asked people if they'd be willing to pay to have more proximity, but not not making parking easier. Would you pay more to make it
Mhm.
easier? Whatever that means to you, like not necessarily, may or may not be closer. Or Russell asked, would you rather have free parking that requires you to walk further, or hunt longer, or parking that costs X dollars an hour but gets you a spot where you want it? So I think that's like I'm just curious your general ideas around how you think best this research could be continued, and maybe if you were going to do it again, what other questions you might ask.
Yeah. I think I'll start with kind of the questions that I did ask. Obviously, I didn't cover everything that was included in my capstone just for the sake of time, and just kind of tried to pin or pull out the questions that had a statistically significant relationship. But Yeah, I think it was to kind of ask hypothetical scenarios to participants to just kind of see where they would fall. Um, I'm trying to look at Russell's question. Asking the question, would you rather have free parking that requires you to walk further or hunt longer for a spot, um, or parking that costs X amount of dollars an hour but guarantees you a available spot? Kind of ties into the question of whether people would want to pay more for a parking spot if they could stay in it longer. I think that, when we see these occupancy rates of market price parking which aim to kind of have this constant turnover, a lot of people kind of just want to park in their space and not have to go back every 2 hours to pay the meter. And so that was why I included that question in my survey. But I think there's definitely ways to expand this research. I think as in LA, just given how big the city and the county is and how there is such diversity across neighborhoods. I think that starting and expanding the research beyond just one neighborhood is kind of where I would go. Like, I would be curious to see how this survey and with expanded questions plays in Koreatown, where it's kind of notorious for the fight of parking, and you just have people waiting for hours to grab a spot. So I think from my view, just kind of expanding beyond this really small geographic scope would be, a great way to start in Los Angeles. And I think for me, also expanding, something that I thought about was how parking pricing policies throughout rural neighborhoods and communities would also be a really interesting avenue of research, just to kind of understand that, because travel behavior varies between urban and rural areas. That could also be kind of an interesting avenue. But yeah, I think there's lots of kind of ways, different questions to get at different people's preferences about how they look at parking and what they would be willing to pay for. Because what I found is that, sometimes you think they might, people might feel one way and it turns out the other way.
I'm going to just take a second and acknowledge that we usually will let these things go for a little bit longer if you're available and if folks are, but if, we are at the time. So if people do have to, if they were planning to leave, I don't think they should feel bad, but I'm happy to go
Totally.
for one question I had, and then I'm going to get to Deanville's question just on the collection. Did you happen to notice, were you tracking occupancy, like total occupancy or availability on the block where you were observing? Like, you said there were spaces across the street usually. Was there ever a time where there was like almost no parking and people were cruising? I'm curious how you think the survey questions might go different if like in different levels of congestion. So were you tracking that while you were observing like how many spaces were actually available?
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
block?
I visited each block at different times of the day. So weekdays during the mornings, weekdays at kind of at those peak commute hours, on weekends, and kind of across the board, the consistent finding was that there was always at least one metered spot open, but there was constantly a fight for free parking. So the free parking spaces were always full, and then there was that kind of metered spaces open. And I think that also kind of relates to your previous question of like where to expand. I think that might be different when you look at market price parking in downtown LA, or in West Venice, these different neighborhoods where people might be going to the area for different things. But yeah, at least in again, it was only 2 blocks in kind of this vast neighborhood. But yeah, it was interesting to see that people were kind of vying for the free parking, because even when had metered spaces open.
And were you interviewing the people that parked in free parking as well, or just the ones that parked in the paid parking?
For my observational study, I wasn't actually interviewing anyone. I was just kind of taking note about what was happening in terms of behavior. So yeah, occasionally, like I said, people came up to me and were asking me questions about what I was doing, but I didn't actively seek out any kind of further research as to like why they were doing what they were doing.
Great. Okay, Deanville asks, what is the difference in the desire for equity and parking between residents and commuters? And I guess if there's, yeah, I don't, yeah.
That's a great question. The difference in the desire for equity and parking between residents and commuters. I mean, I think that's a question that probably varies by neighborhood, but just off the bat, I feel like if there's parking meters in, kind of what we looked at in neighborhoods where there are high levels of people who don't drive, the equity kind of would fall on, if there's all these meters and commuters and visitors to a neighborhood are falling or visiting this area, the equity again might look like, how do we allocate any of the funds into the neighborhood where the parking meters are? But I think the desire between residents and commuters, that would also be a great avenue for further research.
Tim asked if you tracked whether the space was filled by an SUV sorry, single occupancy vehicle versus shared rides. Like, were there passengers? Do you think there would be difference in behavior? You know,
Oh, that's a great point that I would love to include in a separate study. I did make note about like how many people were in the car. Um, so again, if there was a single driver, but I didn't actually analyze that data. It was more just like description of the car type, who was in the vehicle, but I didn't actually look or analyze that data. So I think that again, that could be an interesting aspect to bring in here of like, do parking spaces closer to, the main street, Hollywood Boulevard, go to people with higher occupancy? Obviously that work's being done at businesses and things like that, but I think that would also be an interesting avenue for future research as well.
um, Wendy and Mark ask, and I don't know, maybe you have this information or not. Um, when people were not paying to park, did you receive any or when people don't have $0 free parking available, but I'm guessing this means when they parked for free, did you get any feedback about why they thought they were entitled to free parking? Was it habit? Was because it was always been like that? Was it because I deserve it? Is that, Wendy? I don't know if I'm interpreting this right. You can pop in if you.
So I just wanted to know, we talk about people have, I just thought instead of calling it free parking, maybe we should call it $0 parking. That was my kind of point there. And then I just wanted to know, because I think then you start to get a bit more, oh, actually there is a cost here, but I'm not being charged for it, which is different. It's got a different kind of flavor to it. But I was curious to know whether there'd been any research about why I deserve to get parking for free.
Yeah, I think that well, one, I love the idea of calling it $0 parking because you're right. Then you have this kind of inherent association between there is a cost here. It's just not maybe allocated to you. And I think, yeah, there's been a lot of established, I would say the high cost of free parking in the city. They have a lot of those kind of vignettes. The book club book, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but I think those share a lot about why people feel like they have this kind of entitlement, I guess, to free parking. I would say here in Los Angeles, people would probably argue that because the way the city is built just kind of relies, you need a car, like taking away something that makes that mode of transit harder is kind of a justification I hear of why, just anecdotally, like friends are like, well, we need free parking because otherwise, like, how would I get across the city? So I think it probably varies based on context, but I think those resources offer a lot of good kind of insights into why people think that.
Great. I guess one thing we teased that we might chat about was just that there was a case that you didn't present in the presentation that was in the
Yeah.
paper that was about the Portland's pricing options for equitable mobility committee, which you highlighted as a good example of community input. And I was on that committee, and I'm sad and frustrated to say that after several years, we still have not implemented any of the recommendations in that policy. It's still a great handbook, I think, that people should look at, but it goes to show that you can have, I think with community involvement, sometimes the best of intent, or you can come up with great recommendations, and then you still need political will to maintain or push those forward. And that ties into San Diego. I was checking this out to make sure I knew what was going on. They aren't getting rid of their parking benefit districts, but the city is, well, there was a recommendation I don't understand why it's a grand jury, but like there was a recommendation to get rid of the PBDs, and the city is recommending at least cutting back the amount that they're giving to the community, at least I think maybe more than like in half. They are raising the rate, so they were saying it's going to be about the same amount of money, and it sounds like the main argument was that the way that the neighborhoods were using the money was maybe mismanaged, right? That there was a lot of like the groups that people who were on the committees might have had conflicts of interest and they were spending a lot on administration. So I'm just kind of curious if you have thoughts on how, how, especially in PBDs and these other community groups, how we can, you know, how do you make sure that it actually works? I guess is the question, or doesn't, cause blowback.
I think you're obviously probably the most qualified person to speak about the Portland example. But yes, in my study, I looked at Portland as a good example of developing equitable community engagement. But I think because, when we were chatting and as I was preparing this presentation, I did just kind of look everything up to make sure it was still applicable since this research was done a few years ago. But yeah, I think one thing that stood out to me when I was researching the case studies in Portland was that it seemed like a pretty large committee. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed like there was 20 plus people involved on this task force. And I think sometimes that leads to kind of stagnant progress just because you're dealing with, a large group of people. And then in the San Diego example, I'm curious. Yeah, I want to definitely read more about kind of what's happening there. I think obviously a misallocation of funds is probably the top concern in a scenario like that. And that's why I kind of emphasize the need to have transparent and ongoing ways for people to offer their feedback. Just because when you implement something like this, and if, somebody can say, easily and straightforward, like Google, like who do I contact about what's happening with this parking benefit district? They can offer their feedback and say, why hasn't anything happened with this? And when you kind of take away or don't have that infrastructure ready when the program rolls out, you risk kind of this thing happening where, no one really knows what's going on. And then people don't think it's beneficial. And then, it kind of loses the political steam that it might have had otherwise.
Right. I might think it would be interesting to see if places actually try to do more, even more direct community feedback polling, even just to decide among a menu of acceptable options. We have an issue here in Portland with some of our districts where the committees seem to just want to save up money to build a parking garage, right? Like that's all they want to just hold on to the money and constantly study whether they can build a parking garage, and it just goes on and it could be there has been a move here at least to try to narrow the options, to give reasonable feedback and make sure we're spending the money in the community, but also not leave it so open that it can be captured by other folks. And I think just to say on the pricing options for equitable mobility committee, we came out, I think, with really good recommendations. I think one of the things is is that, they're almost, once again, you have to generate the political will to implement things that are tough, right? If a committee comes back with some easy answers, sure. Or it's, but I think, in that case, I think we actually came up with good ideas, and it's hard to then get a champion to charge more for parking, right? It's always hard that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that kind of, again, plays into like the more research. Like I would love to know kind of what happened with Portland, like where are they at, and kind of in uncovering what happened there. And maybe that's something that we as PRN members can do. But I feel like that's always interesting to look at for sure. And yeah, sometimes too many choices leads to nothing. And so having options that have proven to improve like streetscapes, and maybe bringing in that expertise at that point of here's what we know works, and then kind of giving a menu of options makes it easier, as opposed to kind of giving a blank slate that people then have to figure out what might be beneficial.
Right. Well, I think this was a great conversation. I'm glad that you did this research, and it's a good, hopefully we can inspire some people to do some more. Deanville, you raised your hand. You want to have you have a quick question? We're at 1 o'clock, but if you want to pop.
Yeah, I guess it's just I guess maybe it's how to really put equity with like the idea of pricing parking as value capture to benefit the community, because I mean that's kind of why the equity that's kind of why we're pricing parking as well, to get the value from parking. But if we're going to do it equitably, um it's just I'm still thinking my question here, sorry, but it's just how do we kind of bridge that together? Because it seems like that's what's missing, is that people understand that that parking isn't free, and that there's a cost to it, but we're trying to get the value from that and how to use that value well, and as and just to benefit everybody involved and not harm anyone.
Yeah, I think that's like an ongoing conversation that will probably continue to happen. And part of, the challenge here is, as I mentioned up front, that equity is hard to define and people kind of view that term differently. But I think it's important to acknowledge what you said is like, we are trying here to recognize that parking does result in, or driving and parking results in these adverse effects. And so we don't want to exempt anyone from driving behavior, but how do we reallocate some of the benefit and burden? And so I think one of the crucial recommendations would be offering discounts to certain drivers. And then I think, deciding what's important and what should be invested in, I think ultimately would probably come down to the community and where you're located, again, because there are probably geographic differences of what people deem they need. So yeah, I think it's an ongoing conversation. I don't think there's an easy answer that would be just applicable to everyone. But I think that, you raise a good point and kind of I want to reemphasize that like more research, I think, is beneficial in this area, especially as we see, the popularity of parking and pricing strategies be implemented more across the United States at least.
Great. Well, last question here is Matt asks if you're open to people getting in touch with you afterwards, and can you repost your contact information in here again?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can put my email in the chat.
And then I'll hand it back to Paula to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Tony. And thank you so much, Elena, for being here. And if something happens, I can also help with linking questions with Elena. So you can also direct your questions with me. Oh, Elena just shared her LinkedIn. Thanks so much. And her email. Okay, Elena's email is on the chat.
You.
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It was a great conversation, lots of questions. Maybe we should do a part 2 of this webinar. So thank you so much, Elena.